The arrest of Dr. Kizza Besigye, a leading opposition figure, in November 2005, ignited a national debate. He faced treason and rape charges in the High Court, while simultaneously being tried for terrorism and illegal firearms possession in a military tribunal, the General Court-Martial, alongside 22 others. This dual prosecution of civilians in a military court shocked the legal community and raised urgent questions about constitutional rights and the separation of powers. The Uganda Law Society intervened, arguing that trying civilians in military courts violated the Constitution. They petitioned the Constitutional Court, seeking a declaration that the General Court-Martial lacked jurisdiction over civilians. The Law Society insisted that only independent, impartial civilian courts could guarantee a fair trial. The Constitutional Court agreed, ruling that the UPDF Act sections allowing military trials for civilians were unconstitutional. This was a major win for the Law Society, but the government, through the Attorney General, appealed to the Supreme Court. The case, now Attorney General v. Uganda Law Society, became a defining moment for Ugandan justice. The Supreme Court was tasked with clarifying the limits of military power and the protection of constitutional rights. Its decision would shape the relationship between military and civilian justice for years to come. The stakes were high, not just for Besigye and his co-accused, but for the rule of law in Uganda. The nation awaited a judgment that would set a precedent for the future. The Supreme Court's ruling would determine whether Uganda's constitution truly protected its citizens from overreach by the state. The Supreme Court distilled the case into 4 key legal questions. First, did the General Court-Martial have jurisdiction to try civilians? Second, was the military tribunal a competent, independent, and impartial court as required by the Constitution? Third, were the UPDF Act's provisions allowing military trials for civilians consistent with constitutional guarantees? Fourth, did prosecuting the accused in both civilian and military courts for related charges violate the principle against double jeopardy and fair trial rights? The Law Society argued that military courts, embedded in the military hierarchy, could not be truly independent or impartial. They also challenged the legality of parallel prosecutions, calling them an abusive process. The Supreme Court had to decide if Parliament had overstepped its authority by allowing military courts to try civilians. At stake was whether the Constitution's supremacy would prevail over conflicting laws. The answers to these questions would define the boundaries of justice in Uganda. The Attorney General defended the state's actions, citing the UPDF Act's clear language allowing military trials for civilians found with military-grade weapons. The government argued that military courts were necessary for national security and that Parliament had the authority to create such laws. They insisted the General Court-Martial was a lawful, competent tribunal. The Law Society countered that the Constitution is supreme and only civilian courts should exercise judicial power over civilians. They argued military courts exist solely for enforcing discipline within the armed forces, not for trying ordinary citizens. The Law Society stressed that military tribunals, controlled by the executive, could not guarantee a fair, impartial hearing for civilians. Subjecting civilians to military justice, they said, undermined constitutional rights and the separation of powers. The heart of the dispute: should any law override the Constitution's promise of a fair trial before an independent court? The Supreme Court had to weigh national security against the fundamental rights of citizens. Justice Mulenga, delivering the Supreme Court's judgment, began by reaffirming the Constitution's supremacy. Any law inconsistent with the Constitution, he said, is void. The court found that the General Court-Martial, created to enforce military discipline, was not part of the civilian judicial system. Extending its jurisdiction to civilians infringed on the exclusive authority of ordinary courts. The court emphasized that a fair trial requires independence from the executive, a standard the military tribunal could not meet. Military officers, appointed and answerable to the military command, lacked the necessary independence to try civilians. The UPDF Act's provisions granting military courts power over civilians were found to create a parallel justice system not envisioned by the Constitution. These sections were declared unconstitutional as applied to civilians. The ruling reinforced that only civilian courts can try civilians, safeguarding the right to a fair and impartial hearing. The Supreme Court relied heavily on precedent, especially the Constitutional Court's decision in Joseph Tumushabe v. Attorney General. That case had already ruled military trials for civilians unconstitutional. The Attorney General urged the Supreme Court to overturn this precedent, citing national security concerns. But Justice Mulenga and the majority upheld the earlier decision, affirming its sound constitutional reasoning. By reinforcing the Tumushabe precedent, the Supreme Court underscored the importance of judicial consistency and the supremacy of civilian courts. The judgment became part of a growing legal tradition protecting human rights and the rule of law. The message was clear. Civilian justice cannot be replaced by military tribunals. The Supreme Court decisively dismissed the Attorney General's appeal. It confirmed that the General Court-Martial was not competent to try civilians and struck down the UPDF Act's relevant sections. The court declared that parallel prosecutions in military and civilian courts were unlawful and violated fair trial rights. The ruling ordered an immediate end to the military proceedings against Besigye and his co-accused. Their case was to proceed only in the High Court, the proper civilian forum. This judgment set a binding precedent for all Ugandan courts. It protected citizens from being tried by tribunals lacking independence and impartiality. The Supreme Court's decision was a landmark for constitutional supremacy and the protection of individual rights. It provided a clear path forward for justice in Uganda. The Supreme Court's ruling in Attorney General v. Uganda Law Society is a cornerstone of Ugandan constitutional law. It halted the military trial of opposition figures and reinforced the supremacy of the Constitution. The judgment drew a firm line between military and civilian justice, strengthening the right to a fair trial. It has become a guiding precedent for human rights and the rule of law in Uganda. The decision reassures citizens that justice will be delivered by independent courts, not military tribunals. It stands as a testament to the judiciary's role in defending constitutional order. The legacy of this case endures as a powerful affirmation of Uganda's commitment to justice and the rule of law.